The Electricity Act 2003 was a watershed moment for power sector in India, ushering in several critical reforms. Building on 2 decades of implementation of these reforms and to further competition, we feel that the time is right to deregulate HT supply or undertake carriage and content separation for the HT segment alone. So what do we mean by this being the next frontier of power sector reform? I'm Ann Joshi and I'll be sharing some of these ideas in this short video. These ideas were also shared in our comments to the Ministry of Power on the Electricity Act Amendment Bill, where they sought comments from Prayas and others as part of the public consultation process. In this video, we will first share some of the emerging trends that are shaping the future of the sector. And in that context, share the details of our proposal and some of the actions that are needed to go about it. We recognize that this proposal is quite future oriented and supporting actions are also needed, such as the restructuring of the 7.5 lakh crore of outstanding debt or liabilities, tackling the buildup of annual losses, and increasing accountability for supply and service quality to small consumers. Some of the ideas related to these aspects are detailed in our other publications. An interesting trend in the recent past has been that cross-subsidy revenue contribution to meet the DISCOM expenses is not significant in most states. In fact, over time, industry category tariffs are at or very close to the average cost of supply, and we see very similar alignment even in domestic tariffs. We analyzed the actual category-wise sales and revenue reported in true-up orders for 19 states for FY23 and found that cross-subsidy revenue means less than 5% of the DISCOM expenses in 11 of the 19 states and less than 10% in 17 of 19 states. In fact, it's actually state government contribution that is significant, more than 10% in 12 states and ranging from 24% to 47% in 6 states. Now, this has very interesting and important implications for sector economics and for DISCOM finances. It also means that the industrial tariffs are non-competitive not because of cross-subsidy, but because the cost of supply of the DISCOMs itself is non-competitive as compared to alternate options. This brings us to our next trend of sales migration away from the DISCOM to alternate supply options through open access and captive. Sales migration itself is inevitable and its reversal doubtful due to 3 reasons. One is the attractive economics of renewable energy and storage. If we keep regulatory restrictions aside, today it is technically feasible for consumers to meet almost all their supply requirements for renewable energy and storage at 6 rupees per unit. This 6 rupees is less than the energy charge alone for HT consumers in more than 20 states in India. 2, because open access, particularly from RE, is available to almost all HT consumers with load greater than 100 kilowatt across the country. And 3, because consumer requirement from RE power has also increased with the need for 24/7 carbon-free energy, CBAM requirements, etc. In fact, given these 3 drivers, as well as the exemption from open access on captive, we see that almost half of the non-DISCOM procurement in Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra is from RE-based captive, and it's 72% in Karnataka. Such dependence on variable RE also increases the role of the DISCOM to provide reliability services. What kind of reliability services are DISCOMs providing? 2 notable services are that of banking and standby. Both of these are regulated, but the rates are seldom revised on a regular basis and they are concessional in nature. This chart shows the price of power in India's marginal power market. It shows the variation across seasons and across the day. So during daytime hours, we have prices much closer to 2.5 rupees, but during the evening peak periods, it goes to as high as 8 to 10 rupees per unit. Thus, providing reliability services without notice and planning could be costly for DISCOM, especially non-solar hours. When consumers bank surplus power and offset it with consumption at a later period, they pay 25 paise per unit of energy banked as the charge. However, it costs the DISCOM between 60 paise to 3 rupees per unit to provide that service, so it makes it a loss-making proposition. Similarly, with standby services, the cost of providing unplanned will be much higher than planned standby, and yet the charge is the same in all states except a couple of states, and that is at 25% of the tariffs. So with the quantum of renewable energy growing, providing such services would make DISCOM's power procurement much more complex, increase financial losses. In fact, the tragedy would be that small consumers would end up bearing the brunt of the socialized costs, leading to a scenario where industrial open access consumers are cross-subsidized by other DISCOM consumers. To summarize, cross-subsidy revenues are no longer significant for DISCOMs, and for industry consumers, open access and captive, especially RE-based captive, results in substantial savings even when the tariffs of the DISCOMs are at cost of supply. These substantial savings are hinged on the DISCOM's concessional reliability services and the opportunistic switching between DISCOM and market, which also reduces the incentive for DISCOMs to encourage open access in the state. Thus, DISCOM finances are affected, consumers are unable to truly benefit from market-based procurement and competition, and with regulated tariffs for supply and reliability, there are limited price signals in the market to encourage innovation, aggregation, and unique business models. It is in this context that we are proposing deepening of open access by deregulating tariffs for HT supply and carriage and content for HT, where open access is already operationalized. We propose that states notify HT consumers as deemed open access. Now, what that means is that DISCOMs do not have the obligation to supply to these deemed open access consumers. Regulatory commissions do not set tariffs for the supply to these consumers, and deemed open access consumers have to meet 100% of their supply and standby requirements through market-based options. This could be traders, generators, captive power plants, even DISCOMs, but at market, not regulated rates, and maybe even through a new class of bulk supply licensees, which I will detail later. DISCOMs will continue to be network monopolies and will provide network services on payment of regulated wheeling charge. As this is a major transition for DISCOMs, transition finance support for a finite period is also critical and is discussed later in this presentation. In addition, even though HT networks are relatively robust, two measures can be implemented when necessary towards improved reliability. One is competitive bidding for faster and cost-efficient build-out of sub-transmission assets, and two is the appointment of network franchisees to improve O&M. Deepening open access, introduction of bulk supply licensees and network franchisees together, in our opinion, is better than the proposed parallel licensing approach, as it has inherent inefficiencies, implementation challenges, regulatory lacunae, and where implemented, it has also been subjected to protracted litigation. In the rest of the video, we will discuss some of the operational aspects of the proposed approach. This will include what would be the phase-wise implementation at the state level, how do we de-risk the market supply options for consumers, particularly small and MSME consumers, what is a DISCOM's role in providing reliability services, and some ideas around the time-bound transition finance support for distribution companies. An important aspect of the proposed approach is that states have the flexibility to decide the pace and the manner of the implementation. SERCs, in consultation with the state government, can determine that consumers above a certain voltage level, 33 kV and above, 11 kV and above, depending on the state's context, are deemed to be open access. The supply obligation exemption and the non-determination of SERC tariffs for deemed open access will only kick in 5 years after this announcement. The 5-year transition period provides a DISCOM as well as a deemed open access consumers enough time to adapt to the change in frameworks. After this, DISCOM supply will only be at market rates, and SERCs will only fix wheeling charge, transmission charge, and charge for the supply of last resort provided by the distribution company. We also propose a new class of bulk supply licensees to de-risk market participation of consumers, especially for MSMEs and relatively smaller HT consumers who may be new to market-based procurement. These licensees can be at the state level, multi-state, or even at the national level. They are not cost plus and will sell power at market determined rates. However, for deemed open access and open access consumers, these trades will be based on regulated standard supply agreements. Now, what do we mean by standard agreements? We mean that aspects of energy accounting, scheduling, the responsibility of the licensee, dispute resolution, even aspects of what happens in case of default will be standard across contracts. However, the contracts can vary based on type of the contract, duration of the contract, and aspects also can vary with individual contracts. These contracts need to be approved by the regulatory commission and would also be part of the license conditions. Like trading licenses, these bulk supply licensees will be responsible for scheduling, demand aggregation, communication with the load dispatch center. However, like DISCOMs, they will also be subject to their own standards of performance regulation, will need to set up their consumer grievance redressal forums, etc. And to attract serious players who can improve the market with liquidity, the minimum net worth should be around 500 crores for state level licensees and 2000 crores for multi-state or national licensees. State governments can also set up their own licensees in order to cater to specific consumers or deemed open access consumers in general. DISCOMs can provide standby services using market contracts to any deemed open access consumer. But a critical regulated reliability services that deemed open access consumers can avail from DISCOMs in their area of supply is a supply of last resort. The DISCOM will only provide this service when both the supply and standby arrangement of the consumer fails. To compensate for planning and scheduling challenges with providing this service, the charge determined by the Regulatory Commission should be at least twice the average cost of supply of the DISCOM. Compensate DISCOMs for revenue loss and fulfill supply obligation to small consumers in the transition period, we suggest that the cross-subsidy surcharge and additional surcharge be replaced with a supply obligation charge. However, unlike existing open access charges, we propose that this charge is also applicable on captive, which is the dominant mode of sales migration. The supply obligation charge will be determined by the Regulatory Commission. It will be permanently fixed, so the value reduces over time in real terms and will be capped at 2.5 rupees per unit. So it can also be differentially levied such that open access consumers, RE captive and coal-based captive pay different supply obligation charges. However, notably, 5 years after deregulation is in effect in the state, deemed open access consumers can be exempt from paying the supply obligation charge. Now that we have detailed the elements of the proposal, I would like to say that we believe HT deregulation is a uniquely Indian approach building on the implementation of open access, delicensing of generation and competitive bidding. It has a potential to unlock more than 12 lakh crore of investment in the coming years and encourage new business models, innovation around technology adoption, demand aggregation and demand response. Another unique feature of HT regulation is that while unleashing competitive supply options for HT consumers, it also frees the DISCOM to focus on the issues facing small, low-tension consumers, and it needs to be supplemented with measures to improve accountability for supply and service quality. Having said that, this approach will free up 30% of demand to competition, but with the participation of only 0.26% of total consumers in the country, making energy accounting, monitoring and implementation easier than carriage and content separation for the entire DISCOM or even parallel licensing. This approach is built on the principles of instituting a balanced risk-reward framework. And towards this, it lets HT consumers choose between reliability and price and de-risk the participation of consumers with bulk supply licensees and standard supply contracts. For the DISCOM, it mitigates demand uncertainty and it reduces the risk associated with power procurement. Small consumers would no longer have to bear the burden of cross-subsidizing reliability services provided to open access and captive consumers. Further, it also recognizes that this is a major shift and the approach provides for a 5-year window for implementation and a time-bound supply obligation charge for deemed open access consumers to compensate for the revenue loss of DISCOMs. Another very critical factor is that states retain the flexibility to decide the nature and the pace of the reforms. In fact, large states can even consider implementing elements of the proposed approach within the existing legal framework. I hope this video was useful. We are of course proposing a comprehensive set of reforms that merit discussion, time and fine-tuning. And this presentation and video are accompanied with a note and detailed clause-wise suggestion aimed at furthering this discussion. Thank you so much for your time and attention.